Canada is once again focused on Aboriginal title, after the Supreme Court of British Columbia determined in its August 2025 Cowichan decision that Aboriginal title extended over hundreds of acres of privately owned lands within the city of Richmond, just south of Vancouver. So what is Aboriginal title and how do courts decide if it exists? First, Aboriginal title is what's called sui generis. It's Latin for in a class by itself. It's not simply private ownership as it's thought of in the common law countries, but it's not entirely different either. It exists as a hybrid of the common law concept of land ownership and the principles of property ownership found in Indigenous legal systems. It's an example of the court reconciling Aboriginal interests with those of greater Canadian society. The Supreme Court of Canada in 1997 identified two primary characteristics of Aboriginal title. First, Aboriginal title gives Indigenous communities the exclusive right to use and occupy lands. On its face, that looks a lot like the common law concept of private property. But there's a second element as well. The use of the lands must not be irreconcilable with the nature of the Indigenous community's connection to those lands. The Supreme Court of Canada used the example that if the lands are important to an Indigenous community because of their hunting value, the lands couldn't be used in a manner that destroyed their value as hunting grounds, for example, through strip mining. Establishing Aboriginal title requires satisfying a 2- or 3-part test set out by the Supreme Court of Canada, depending on the circumstances. First, the Indigenous community must demonstrate it sufficiently occupied the lands. Sufficiency requires a blend of common law and Indigenous perspectives. There must be evidence of strong presence over the claimed lands, with conduct that demonstrates that the lands in question belong to, were controlled by, or were otherwise under the exclusive stewardship of the claiming group. The second requirement for establishing Aboriginal title is only necessary in certain circumstances. If an Indigenous group wants to use their present occupation of land to demonstrate historic occupation of the same lands, they must demonstrate that their occupation traces back to the assertion of sovereignty. This part of the test isn't typically used, nor is it required in each case. Third, the Indigenous community must demonstrate that they held the lands exclusively. This requires an Indigenous community to establish that they had the intention and capacity to retain exclusive control over the lands, including as against other Indigenous communities. Without exclusivity, Indigenous communities may still have rights to use the land, such as for hunting and fishing. But establishing Aboriginal title requires demonstrating that the lands belong to the Indigenous community claiming the Aboriginal title, and not to another community. Once Aboriginal title is established by the Indigenous community, current landowners may be able to raise defenses, such as the defense that Aboriginal title was extinguished prior to 1982. But that's a topic for another video.